back, Future Geniuses, and today we're going to talk about what actually brings the United States into World War I. We've talked about kind of the end of the war in Europe, and so this is a little bit of a backtrack, but I think it's kind of easier to group the war by theaters, by the European theater and the Pacific theater, so that it makes a little more sense. So just understand that for the first part of these notes, we're actually going to go back in time to 1941, to December 7th, 1941, when the Japanese attacked this place, Pearl Harbor, the U.S. naval fleet that was stationed on the Hawaiian Islands. Now, the same day that the Japanese attack Pearl Harbor, they also attack other islands around the Pacific, in particular the Philippines, and their goal is to try to crush the American naval force in the Pacific. By spring of 42, almost all of Southeast Asia, and much of the Western Pacific Islands had been taken over by the Japanese, and their goal really is to keep the American military out of the Pacific. They feel like if they can do that, they will have an easier time controlling the Pacific and staving off any future attacks that the Americans will fight. Now, it is worthy of noting that when the attacks happened, many of the generals from Japan actually show regret about doing this. Many of them said, "We fear we have awoken a sleeping lion, that the American military might be a little too much for us." And in some way, that is very true. The attacks do have one thing. One unifying thing, and that is they bring everybody together around fighting the war. Before the war, there had been isolationists, and then there had been pro-war individuals who had wanted to go and fight with the rest of our allies. And they had always been kind of going back and forth, but America had largely stayed out of the war other than sending supplies and military aid. This attack unifies the country around going to war and mobilizing, and America does it very quickly. We will talk much more in class about what America's response is during the war to this call to arms. But just understand that America will join the Allied powers. They will become and nationalist China to try to defeat Japan, Italy, Germany, and any of the other Axis powers, some of the smaller countries that had joined up with him. Now, Hitler declares war on the United States 4 days after Pearl Harbor. So does Mussolini. And so it's on now. Well, we've talked about what happened in Europe. Now let's talk about what's happening kind of in the rest of the Asian theater. Now, General Douglas MacArthur, that is this guy right over here, down there in the corner with the corncob pipe, he is actually put in charge of all of the Allied forces in the Pacific. So you've got MacArthur, who's in charge of the Pacific theater, and you have Eisenhower, who's in charge of the European theater of the war. By mid-April 1942, American bombers begin attacking Tokyo. And the Battle of the Coral Sea, which was May 7th and through May 7th and 8th in 1942, the American naval forces stopped the Japanese advancement on Australia and actually saved the country of Australia from being invaded by the Japanese and taken over. The turning point of the war in Asia comes on June 4th, 1942. At the Battle of Midway Island, where the United States defeated the Japanese Navy. This allowed the U.S. to begin what was known as island hopping, which means they literally would go to one island, kick out the Japanese, set up a base of operations, and then move to the next island. And they'd literally hop like a rabbit from island to island. In 1944, American forces captured Guam and then destroyed the Japanese fleet in the Philippines. And American forces now starts to close in on Japan itself. They're starting to slowly encapsulate and cut off the island. By March 1945, American troops seized the islands of Iwo Jima and in June, the islands of Okinawa. Unfortunately, this gentleman right here, President Roosevelt, he does not live to see the German surrender. He passes away, and Vice President Harry Truman is sworn in as president. And the American forces begin to advance closer and closer to the Japanese islands. Truman's really starting to be left with a difficult decision to make as to whether or not he should use a newly developed weapon known as the atomic bomb to try to end the war in Japan. By using the atomic bomb, Truman hoped that American troops would avoid invasion of the Japanese mainland and many more casualties. At least that's what they've told everybody in the press. Only 2 bombs were available, and nobody really knew exactly how effective they would be. They knew they could be very destructive, but they weren't totally sure. So Truman decides to use the bombs. The first bomb was dropped on the Japanese city of Hiroshima on August 6, 1945. They were given an advance warning, but many in the Japanese government felt like it was just kind of, hot air. They didn't think it was a real threat, or they didn't know exactly how big the effectiveness of the bomb would be, and so they largely goes unignored. They drop the bomb, and it has massive destructive forces. 3 days later, a second bomb is dropped on the city of Nagasaki. 70,000 die in the bombing of Hiroshima. 40,000 die in the bombing of Nagasaki, but thousands more die as a result of the bomb's radiation that is left over afterwards. As a result, by August 14th, 1945, the Japanese do surrender, and because of these bombs, because they cannot possibly continue to take on blow after blow after blow like this. The atomic bomb's effectiveness literally wipes out cities. We will look at this much more in class, but I just want you to understand that this is total destruction. There's very little left. I mean, people are literally vaporized because of the blast itself. All of this leads up to what is known as VJ Day, which is Victory in Japan Day, and it signals the final end of the war. But before we get to that point, we're going to talk much more about the atomic bomb, its creation, its usage, and what are the ramifications for using it after the war. This is going to create what is known as the Cold War, quite frankly. This grab for power and this ability to have this highly destructive weapon. We'll talk much more about that in our next video. Until then, make sure you have all of this information in your notes. If you have any questions, make sure you add those to your notes as well. I will see you all tomorrow in class. Have a great rest of your day. Bye.